I've just finished reading this book, Precipitous City, The Story of Literary Edinburgh by Trevor Royle. And I wanted to talk to you about it because, for starters, it was very good and it's right up my street and it's very much in keeping with the kind of stuff I talk about on the podcast, Edinburgh's most powerful podcast. And the other reason I wanted to talk to you about it is because of how hard I had to work to get a copy of this book. I kind of feel like it owes me one. It owes me a video. I've known about the existence of this book for years, almost as long as I've lived in Edinburgh. And although it's out of print, it's widely available online, but nowhere could I find it for a reasonable price, for less than about 60 or 70 quid, which is too much for a book that you're effectively taking a punt on, far too much. I found it on eBay a bunch of times and always got pipped to the post at the last minute in the classic eBay fashion. I assumed that it would just crop up in one of Edinburgh's many secondhand bookshops. Never once found it. And then perhaps the most sort of farcical episode in trying to get a copy of Precipitous City was a bookshop I really like, first-hand bookshop, put a post on their Instagram saying that someone had just dropped off a bag of secondhand books, mistakenly thinking that they were a secondhand bookshop or a charity bookshop. And they'd put a picture of all of the books that are in the bag and said, look, we can't sell these, we're a first-hand bookshop, so, first come, first serve if you want one. One of them was Precipitous City, so I immediately messaged going, yes, hold that one, I'll be right there. I can't quite remember what happened, but they either figured out they can't even legally give them away, or they thought maybe the better thing is to give them to charity. Anyway, by the time I got there, or by the time I called, they decided to give them to a charity shop. I called the charity shop saying, you've just had a bag dropped off. It's got a book called Precipitous City in it. Can you put it to one side for me? And they said, oh, we can't do reservations, I'm afraid. And I said, okay, but just like any chance you could just keep that bag or keep that book, just keep an eye on it. I will be there in 5 minutes. Nothing we can do, I'm afraid. So I pegged it to this charity bookshop and they just sold it to someone that they assumed was me from the phone. They were quite apologetic about it. So it felt cursed. And then in December, the worst month for buying books for yourself, I found it in a secondhand bookshop I'm in all the time for about 7 quid. Anyway, sorry for the very convoluted book buying story, but just to give you a measure of how prized this has become and how large it looms in my imagine. I don't really hunt for books that long. I have a large collection of books, but I wouldn't really call myself a collector in terms of looking for editions or looking. I don't really struggle to find the sort of books I want to get my hands on. So anyway, obviously it would be a much better story if I could finish this video by saying, and the book is crap, but unfortunately it's actually very good. So it's a history of literary Edinburgh, right up my street, as I say. I've read a bunch of books like this. There are hundreds of them. Some of them are quite touristy. They're kind of like dry runs for walking tours, literary walking tours. Some of them very dry runs. And then some of them are excellent, but some of them very academic. This one is a lean 200-page history from the time of William Dunbar to the modern day. I think it came out in about 1980, so up to late 20th century. Muriel Spark, Hugh MacDiarmid, and I thought it was really excellent. As I said, it's only 200 pages long, so it doesn't have much space to stray very far from the canonical artery of Edinburgh writers. So there's a lot about Scott, Stevenson, Burns, the figures you'd expect. But it does, some of the minor authors do crowd in there. And if you were looking for a book to put together a reading list for Edinburgh writing or in Scottish writing, you could do a lot worse than use Precipitous City as your base of operations. Even though it's a lot of familiar ground, I really enjoyed the way that Trevor Royle put the book together. He breaks up Edinburgh's literary history into ages. So you have the age of Walter Scott, you have the Enlightenment age, you have the Victorian era, modern era, the sort of dawn of Scots poetry early on. But the way that he's very attentive to the transitions between those eras and the way that he makes them sort of artificially speak to each other to sort of pass the torch on from one age to the other, I thought was really slick. Really, he had a really light touch, given how much history he was handling. And one of the ways that he managed to keep them talking to each other is that he focused on the Edinburgh authors that actually wrote about Edinburgh. So there's a lot of quotation of authors summarising Edinburgh, trying to describe what it is about Edinburgh that appeals to the literary imagination. And so you have this artificial sense of all of these luminaries from different eras kind of speaking to each other about this one subject, Edinburgh. It's a good filtering mechanism. It means that he doesn't really give much time to Edinburgh authors who were born here but didn't really stay, didn't really reflect on the city much. So that includes famous authors like Arthur Conan Doyle, who's really only a footnote in this book because although he was born here, he left and didn't really, relatively speaking, write a great deal about Edinburgh. Although fans of Conan Doyle will be familiar with the ways in which Edinburgh had an effect on him and his writings, studying under Joseph Bell and the effect that had on his creation of Holmes. Just to give you a couple of recurring themes throughout the book, one is fairly predictable. It's the story of a city of writers that can't decide really what language to write in. The back and forth between writing in Scots and writing in English. Those writers who wrote in Scots and were pressured into writing in English by publishers who thought they could make more money that way. Authors that wrote in English and were disowned by their fellow Scots for turning their back on the motherland. And then of course those authors that did both, like Robert Louis Stevenson. That's a well-known and ancient story in Scottish writing and indeed Scotland in general. But it's really interestingly presented here. And I think it casts a really interesting and at times problematic light on one of the recurring themes along Royle's mile of Edinburgh authors, which is to what extent they are backward looking, to what extent they are trying to nail down Scottish history through literature, or to live in a kind of dream of Scottish history that has more to do with wishful thinking than fact. Royle mentions Edward Muir's response to Walter Scott's novels, saying that once a nation has lost its identity, it replaces it with legend. That's a really interesting dynamic in this particular literary story. And one of the other striking running themes is that of exile. Just how many Edinburgh authors didn't really hang around? Most famous case probably is Burns, who has an immortal association with the city, despite only having been here for what amounted to a glorified gap year. I've already mentioned Conan Doyle, who put Edinburgh in his rearview mirror at the first opportunity. But the list just goes on and on. James Hogg, Muriel Spark, Hugh MacDiarmid, and of course Robert Louis Stevenson, who clearly suffered from a very contradictory combination of wanderlust and homesickness throughout his life. Wrote a lot about Edinburgh from a distance, like a lot of these writers. And in fact, the title, Precipitous City, is taken from verses written by Stevenson towards the end of his life, nostalgically looking back on Edinburgh. So I highly recommend the book. I kind of don't want to hear it if you find a copy easily, but it's always worth keeping an eye out in secondhand bookshops. But yes, that's Precipitous City. That's all from me. Happy New Year, and until next time, happy reading.